Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're going to be tackling a really interesting battle, one that might not be as famous as Yorktown or Saratoga,
Right.
but it really sheds light on the challenges and, frankly, the growing pains of the early Continental Navy.
Definitely. I think this one's a real hidden gem.
Yeah, and we're talking about the Battle of Block Island.
Aye. Yes, Block Island. April 1776.
That's right, April 1776, the waters off of Rhode Island.
Setting the scene.
We've got Commodore Esek Hopkins leading a fleet fresh off a victory down in Nassau, loaded with captured British supplies.
A pretty significant haul, actually.
They run smack into HMS Glasgow, a Royal Navy dispatch ship. Now here's where things get really interesting. Hopkins has 7 ships under his command.
A considerable force.
Versus the Glasgow's one. On paper, it looks like an easy American victory.
You'd certainly think so.
But, surprise, surprise, history records this as a British victory.
It's one of those head-scratchers that make you dig deeper.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're diving into the primary sources, the first-hand accounts, to understand what happened that night, why it played out the way it did, and the kind of ripple effects it had.
Because it really did have some lasting consequences.
Okay, so first, let's set the stage. It's April 6th, 1776. We're talking about a very specific location, off Block Island, Rhode Island. For those who love their coordinates, it's around 40.90 degrees north, 71.25 degrees west.
Right near those popular fishing grounds.
Exactly, and we're talking about Commodore Hopkins' flagship, the USS Alfred, on its maiden voyage.
Brand spanking new.
So let's talk about the forces involved. The Brits have HMS Glasgow, a 20-gun frigate commanded by Captain Tryingham Howe. On the American side, you have, as we said, 7 ships. You've got the USS Alfred, also packing 20 guns.
Inching firepower, at least on paper.
Then you have the USS Cabot, the USS Andrew Doria, the USS Columbus, the USS Providence, and 2 smaller vessels, the brigs USS Fly and USS Wasp.
Quite the flotilla.
Now, the Glasgow is on a pretty important mission. It was carrying vital dispatches from Newport, Rhode Island, down to the British fleet that was gathering off Charleston, South Carolina. They were preparing for a major assault on Charleston.
So those dispatches were pretty high stakes.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, the Continental Navy was returning from their successful raid on Nassau in the Bahamas, where they captured a significant amount of British military supplies.
Guns, gunpowder, you name it.
And they even snagged 2 prize ships on their way back north.
Adding to their fleet.
So you'd think they'd be in a pretty good position, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that they were facing some significant challenges.
Yeah, those victories always come at a cost.
Disease had swept through the crews, mainly fevers and smallpox.
Always a danger in those close quarters.
And they also had to man those captured prize ships.
Stretching their manpower thin.
So even though they had superior numbers, their actual fighting strength was probably less than ideal.
It's something historians often have to factor in.
Right. And to make things even more complicated, just before the encounter with the Glasgow, they'd captured 2 more ships, HMS Hawke and Bolton.
Adding even more strain to their resources.
So they're sailing along, maybe feeling a bit overextended, and Hopkins had his fleet organized into 2 scouting columns. The eastern column was led by the USS Cabot, with the Alfred following behind. The western column was led by the USS Andrew Doria, followed by the USS Columbus. And the Providence, along with the Fly and the Wasp, were further back, escorting those captured prizes.
So pretty spread out formation.
It was a clear night, almost a full moon. It must have been pretty bright out on the water. Between 1 and 2 in the morning, the Andrew Doria and the Glasgow spot each other. They're about 20 to 24 nautical miles southeast of Block Island. The American fleet was heading south.
And the Glasgow, I presume, was heading west towards Charleston.
Right. Now, Captain Howe on the Glasgow, he could have just kept sailing, you know.
Avoided a potential confrontation.
Exactly. But he didn't. He decided to investigate, turns the Glasgow around, starts closing in on the American ships.
A bold move.
Over the next half hour, he gets close enough to hail them.
So he's intentionally engaging.
Now, here's where things start to unravel a bit for the Americans. Commodore Hopkins, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, he doesn't issue any formal signals to his fleet.
No battle formation, no coordinated plan of attack.
So the Continental ships, they're not forming a line of battle. Instead, it becomes what one captain later described as a helter-skelter engagement.
Sounds chaotic.
It was. Howe first approaches the Cabot, which was commanded by Hopkins' own son, John Hopkins.
Oh, wow. Father and son in the same battle.
Yeah. The Glasgow hails the Cabot, asking for identification. John Hopkins responds, names two of the ships, the Columbus and the Alfred.
Did he correctly identify them?
Well, he actually exaggerated the Alfred's firepower a bit, called
Mhm.
it a 22-gun frigate when it really only had 20 guns. But then things take a sudden turn.
What happened?
According to some accounts, an American sailor on the Cabot, maybe a bit too eager, throws a grenade onto the deck of the Glasgow.
Talk about jumping the gun when...
And that basically starts the battle, without any real plan or coordination.
So much for a tactical approach.
The Cabot, remember, it's a smaller ship. It fires one volley at the Glasgow, but it's ineffective, and then it drifts away from the main action.
Not the start they were hoping for.
Now the focus shifts to the Alfred and the Glasgow. They exchange broadsides. But almost immediately, the Alfred takes a hit that severs its tiller lines.
That's critical. The tiller controls the rudder, right?
Exactly. So the Alfred loses its steering and starts drifting uncontrollably right into the line of fire from the Glasgow.
Oh, that's bad. Makes them a sitting duck.
It gets worse. The Alfred drifting like that, it prevents the Andrew Doria, which was commanded by Captain Nicholas Biddle, from joining the fight effectively.
They're probably worried about colliding.
Right. The Providence, meanwhile, it stays out of the main action entirely.
Just watching from the sidelines.
The Columbus eventually does join the fight, but its fire is described as both late and inaccurate.
So not much of a threat to the Glasgow.
No. Now, the Glasgow, despite being outnumbered and taking fire from multiple ships, it was still in pretty good shape. So Captain Howe decides to break off the engagement. He didn't want to risk being boarded.
Smart move. He recognized the danger of being overwhelmed.
He manages to steer the Glasgow away from the American ships and head towards Newport.
Did the Americans pursue?
They tried, but remember, they were weighed down by all that captured cargo and the prize ships.
Right, their speed would have been compromised.
After a few hours, Commodore Hopkins calls off the chase. He didn't want to run into the main British squadron at Newport.
Understandable.
The only thing they managed to capture was the Glasgow's tender, a small support vessel. The Continental fleet, a bit battered and probably pretty discouraged, they finally anchor in New London, Connecticut on April 8th.
So what was the damage casualty-wise?
Well, the difference is pretty striking. The Glasgow only suffered 1 killed and 3 wounded.
All from musket fire, I believe?
Yeah. The Cabot had the most American casualties, 4 killed and 7 wounded. The Alfred lost 6 killed and 6 wounded. Even the Andrew Doria had its drummer wounded.
Those are very light casualties for the British, especially considering they were outnumbered.
It really highlights the ineffectiveness of the American gunnery.
Lack of training, perhaps?
Maybe. The reaction back in the colonies was mixed. John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, he actually praised Hopkins.
Really? Despite the outcome?
Yeah. But of course, this failure to capture a single enemy ship, despite having 7 of their own, it gave plenty of ammunition to those who were critical of the Continental Navy.
I can imagine.
And some of that criticism was very direct. Captain Nicholas Biddle, remember, he was on the Andrew Doria. He called it a more imprudent, ill-conducted affair that never happened.
Ouch, that's a pretty harsh assessment.
And it wasn't just talk. There were actual consequences. Captain Abraham Whipple of the Columbus, he was accused of cowardice.
That's a serious charge.
He actually demanded a court-martial to clear his name.
Did he succeed?
Yeah, he was cleared of cowardice, but the court did criticize some of his decisions during the battle.
So his reputation still took a hit?
Captain John Hazard of the Providence, he wasn't so lucky. His own officers brought charges against him, including neglect of duty during the fight with the Glasgow. He was convicted by the court-martial and forced to resign his commission.
A very public and humiliating end to his career.
And Commodore Hopkins himself, he also faced scrutiny from Congress. He was called out for violating his orders by going to Nassau instead of the Carolina coast, and for distributing the captured goods without consulting them.
So it wasn't just about the battle itself.
Right, it was about his overall conduct. He ended up being formally censured by Congress.
That's a significant rebuke.
And to make matters worse, later that year, several of the fleet's ships were trapped in Providence. The British had occupied Newport, and they were short on crew.
So they couldn't even sail.
No. And Commodore Hopkins, his career in the Continental Navy came to an end in 1778 when he was dismissed from service.
It's a reminder that even early victories can have long-lasting repercussions.
What about the Glasgow? What happened to it?
Well, despite the damage, it managed to make it back to Newport.
But without its dispatches.
It had to throw them overboard to lighten the load.
The damage was so bad that they had to send it back to England for repairs. And its original mission, delivering those dispatches, had been given to another ship, HMS Nautilus.
So the Glasgow's part in the war was essentially over.
This whole episode really puts the Battle of Block Island into perspective, doesn't it? It wasn't just some random naval skirmish.
It was a microcosm of the larger challenges facing the Continental Navy.
We see the inexperience, the impact of disease, the lack of coordination, the leadership issues.
And the political fallout.
Right. They had the numbers, but they lacked the experience, the strategy, the discipline to win.
And it cost them.
So it makes you think, how important were these early, sometimes messy engagements in shaping the future of the American Navy? What lessons did the Continental Congress learn from this helter-skelter affair? What would they do differently next time?
That's a really interesting question. It makes you think about the importance of learning from mistakes, even, or maybe especially, in the early stages of a war. These early setbacks, they might have been frustrating and embarrassing at the time,
Yeah.
but they likely forced the Americans to take a hard look at themselves, to identify their weaknesses, to figure out how to improve their naval tactics and leadership.
So they could eventually become the force they needed to be.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that sometimes those early struggles are what paved the way for future success.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. If you're interested in learning more about this fascinating period of naval history, there are tons of resources out there. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, folks.